Is the ongoing immigration crackdown harming Christians? What can we do about it? That's the topic of today's Faith and Culture. Welcome to Faith and Culture. I'm Tré Goins-Phillips, and I'm joined by our guest today, Chelsea Sobolik. Chelsea, how are you?
Good. Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, it's good to have you and good to talk about your work with World Relief, especially with immigration reform and illegal immigration reform, which is something that, of course, is a huge issue. And, I think there are a lot of issues vying for our attention right now across the country. And as believers, we want to care about a lot of them. And immigration is one that is so important, and immigration reform in particular is important. So let's just start with a broad overview. Why, as Christians, should immigration reform be something that's at the top of our minds?
It's a great question, and it's something that I care a lot about. I work for World Relief, which is one of the refugee resettlement organizations here in the U.S. I'll say at the top, immigration is an incredibly complex, complicated, and nuanced issue. Our immigration law is very complex. I won't pretend to be I'm not an immigration lawyer, but Scripture has a lot to say about how Christians treat one another. Scripture does not give us our immigration policy, and I'm not going to pretend that it does, but it does give us some things we balance in tension. Scripture does talk about honoring and obeying laws and borders, and it does talk about how we love our neighbor and the vulnerable and the least of these. And so, Christians, I think, balance those two things in tension. But for Christians to, our approach of this issue of immigration should first and foremost start with where Scripture starts about people and humanity, that all people are made in God's image and have innate dignity, worth, and value. And so that should shape how we think about this issue. It should shape how we speak about this issue, how we treat our neighbors. America certainly cannot welcome everyone who wants to come here. And, I'm not going to pretend that we could, but we should have thoughtful conversations about immigration reform, about what our laws are doing, aren't doing, should be doing, all that kind of stuff. But I think for Christians, it's really important to first and foremost start where Scripture starts about who we are as people, and that is made in God's image.
Yeah, for sure. And, you've recently been working specifically with a pastor who immigrated years ago from Iran and has several asylum-seeking congregants in his church who've been detained by ICE and may very well themselves be sent back to Iran, where it's, of course, very dangerous for believers. So tell us a little bit about that interaction and what you've learned in your coordination with him.
Yeah, so Pastor Ara is a pastor of Cornerstone Church in Los Angeles, and about a month ago, so their church speaks English, Spanish, and Farsi. And like you said, he himself, he's a refugee or former refugee from Iran. I've been accompanying him on Capitol Hill and gotten to hear more of his story firsthand. And he was a very strong Christian, was tortured in Iran for being a Christian. Just a very powerful personal story. He came to the U.S. He's now a U.S. citizen, which is such a powerful story in and of itself. But he has a big heart and ministry to people coming to the U.S. from Iran. And about a month ago, two families in his church were detained by ICE, and he actually filmed one of the interactions, and it went viral online. And so he's been given a platform now to talk about this story. And so, like you said, these people who were arrested are Christians who are fleeing persecution in Iran and are seeking asylum and safety in the U.S. So we're very concerned about their safety and well-being, and again, extraordinarily concerned of what could happen if they were sent back to Iran as Christians.
And something you said, Chelsea, just at the start of our conversation is that immigration is an incredibly complex issue, right? We want people who want to come here and immigrate to the United States. We're a nation of immigrants, so we want to celebrate that, but we want to celebrate people doing it the correct way and people who are coming here and going through the process. But then you think about that too, and the process itself is cumbersome and clunky and can be incredibly difficult and drawn out for people, especially who are facing violence in their own country and wanting to seek asylum in our country. It's important that that be more expedited. So anyway, we could go on and on about the complexities of this issue, but for conservatives who may say, I think this is just a black and white thing. Somebody broke the law by coming into the country illegally, so it's case closed. They need to be removed. But as you've kind of laid out in this situation with Christian immigrants from Iran, just sending them back home could very well be giving them a death sentence.
Absolutely. I think what you said is exactly right. There are multiple things to balance. And, I'm not against deportation as a tool to get the worst of the worst of the worst, the horribly violent criminals out of our country. I think where we are concerned is that there is some nuance in this, that these individuals have pending asylum claims and cases that they're trying to make their way through the court system. Viewers might or might not know that the asylum process right now is taking years and years for cases to be adjudicated. It's not a quick thing. I'm hoping it could become quicker, but it's not a quick, approve or denied. It takes a long time. And so, I would say to people who are thinking, balancing these really complex issues, that we can't just paint with a broad brush, that there is some nuance in this. And if there are Christians or people who have valid asylum claims, that they should be able to make those and hear their process here in the U.S. And I'll say quickly, too, one of the complexities of immigration is the laws can change from administration to administration, and it's been, decades since Congress has passed anything comprehensive. So it is confusing and tricky because things can change so much from administration to administration.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it seems like we live in a nation that's constantly on a pendulum swing, right? We have just a very reactionary politics, and some of it is completely understandable. Something certainly needs to be done about illegal immigration. Whatever that action we take, it's going to hurt, right? There are going to be people who are going to be hurt by this because it's such a huge change, as you said, from administration to administration. But of course, as you also mentioned, there needs to be some nuance there. So for people who might not be familiar with the work of World Relief, talk about the advocacy that you do on Capitol Hill to help kind of bring some of that nuance to the process.
Yeah, what a great question. I love this question, and it's my job to get to do this. So I mentioned we're one of the refugee resettlement organizations, and that process has actually been paused since the beginning of the year. But we're advocating for the refugee resettlement program to resume in some capacity because it is one of the legal ways that people fleeing religious persecution can apply to come to the United States. You said there's, we want people who are able to do things the right and legal way, and the refugee resettlement program is that way. And so we're really advocating for this program to be reopened and resumed so that people fleeing from Afghanistan and Iran, fleeing persecution because they're Christians, can be welcomed here into the U.S. So that's one part. We're also a humanitarian organization around the world, and we serve in places like Ukraine and Haiti and Sudan. And so some of the places that are facing war and conflict and really dangerous situations. And so we do things like food aid and medical aid and things like that there. So I love getting to serve people here in the U.S., but also having partnering with local churches around the world to serve individuals globally as well.
Yeah. Well, look, there's a lot more that we want to get to. We'll be right back with more Faith and Culture. Everybody, stick with us. Welcome back to Faith and Culture. We're joined by Chelsea Sobolik. Chelsea, we've seen this huge crackdown on illegal immigration in the 6 months of this new Trump administration, and it's impacting Christians and even pastors in places like Central America, people who are fleeing areas in the Middle East, as we've talked about. So people who are otherwise law-abiding are being detained because they're showing up for their check-ins with ICE. So why does it seem as if they're being targeted?
Yeah, I'll say we talked about earlier about Pastor Ara, and one of the things he has shared that's really stuck out to me that I'm very grateful for is he's told his congregate members, you need to be a good Christian and you need to be a good citizen. Those two matter. And so he has told his congregate members, if you have a check-in with ICE for your while you're here that you're supposed to go to, you need to go to it and be a good citizen. We've seen people, like you said, one of these couples had shown up at their ICE hearing and were detained and weren't given reasons for their detainment. And we've seen this with these two couples and certainly with others. And I'm not sure completely why they're detaining people with pending asylum claims and whatnot. But I think one thing that is really important is that even individuals who are deported or maybe their asylum claim won't be adjudicated in a way that will allow them to stay in the U.S. Due process is extremely important, and we should make sure that persecuted Iranian Christians get due process and others get due process. And so making sure the systems and laws continue to work well, I think is really important. But we've seen this, throughout the country that people are detained and reasons aren't quickly given.
Yeah. Yeah, so I know we've spent most of this conversation so far talking about the Christians who are, facing being sent back to their countries of origin. We're a Christian network. This is a Christian show, but I know that World Relief does work with non-Christians as well. What are the Bible verses, the Bible lessons that really undergird and inspire the work that you do and really, force you to have this view of having a nuanced perspective when it comes to immigration?
What a great question. I love that. My whole career, I worked on Capitol Hill for a number of years. I actually worked on immigration on the Hill. My boss was a member from a border state. But I've also worked on policies that touch on the preborn, on orphans and vulnerable children, on a number of different policy issue areas that touch on the lives of vulnerable in some capacity. And at World Relief, and then personally as well, I am so deeply shaped by, I said this earlier, but what Scripture says about humanity. And I think if we took that call to view humanity as image bearers, I know we hear this so often and we even say it so often, but I think it really would change so much of our interactions with others, but also interacting and thinking through and thinking deeply about really complex issues. And so people fleeing violence and oppression, I'm a mom, and I think about the moms who have walked miles and miles and miles through whole countries to seek safety. And, maybe they won't be able to get safety and refuge in the US. But I think it's important, even if our laws can't support safety here in the US for that woman and her child, to think about too that human story and impact of what people outside of our borders are facing. So the human dignity is something I come back to very, very often. And then the life of Jesus. Jesus, throughout his life, you see him interacting with people who were not followers of him. You see him interacting with religious leaders, with the least of these as well. And so I think both carrying that human dignity as a person, as an organization, coupled with what does Scripture say about how we are to interact with government, interact with the church, and interact with individuals, those kind of three spheres that we're called to in Scripture. And so I think those two things, holding those together as you interact on, again, very complex issues, very nuanced. Those are two things I come back to as an organization, we also come back to as well.
Yeah. You've done a lot of work, as you said, on a number of different issues that Christians that we care about, from, preborn to immigration. And you worked on Capitol Hill with a lawmaker, as you said, who was on a border state, and now you work with World Relief. So have there been times, Chelsea, when you've realized, oh, my view about immigration has shifted some over the years because I've seen it more up close?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I worked on Capitol Hill, I approached the issue simply from a policy perspective. I have been a Christian for a long time, so I was a Christian when I was working on it, but worked at another organization that also worked on immigration and realized I'd actually never sat down and thought about it deeply from a biblical issue. And that was concerning and alarming to me that it's such a broad issue, and I never really thought about it very deeply. And one of the scriptures I go back to very often is, scripture talks a lot about how we care for the poor in general and whatnot. But then there's three groups that scripture is especially concerned with, that the heart of God is especially tender to, and it's orphans, widows, and the sojourner or the foreigner. And I love getting to dive into those. And again, we balance that with laws and policy and all of that. But God's heart throughout Scripture is especially tender to those three groups. And, they are people who experience the most vulnerable things. In times of war and conflict, people are forced to flee to find safety. It's a forced displacement. In times of war and conflict, children and women pay a very heavy price. And so, I've thought a lot about this as I've wanted to be both a good, public policy maker and advocate, but also approach my work from a biblical perspective as well.
Mm. There are a lot of people who would say, I see an endless list of issues that we've experienced because as a country, we've refused to really address illegal immigration. It's just kind of a political football that both parties pass back and forth, and they just wanted somebody to take action. And, in some respects, we can see that's what President Trump has been doing. And I think compassion has kind of been used in some circles as a way to just kick the can down the road, say, well, we need to be compassionate. So then what ends up happening is we don't do anything, right? So you've talked a lot about the importance of having that balance, even just then, about, we need to welcome people who are sojourners. We need to do the things that are close to the heart of Jesus, but we're also a nation of laws, and we need to follow our laws and implement our laws. So where have you landed on a good balance kind of between taking those hard and necessary steps of correction, but also still being loving and caring about people the way that Jesus cares about us?
Yeah, well, I would point to Congress on this one, that it's been decades since
Yeah.
Congress has really done anything comprehensive and meaningful on our immigration laws. We just saw with the One Big Beautiful Bill that, millions and billions of dollars were given to enforcement, which I can talk about, but I would say this is really where Congress needs to do their job,
Yeah.
because frankly, it's unfair to people trying to seek an immigration status in the US, and it's unfair to American people for things to change very quickly, change very often, and there's just so much confusion about what's happening. Is this all those types of things? So I would really point to Congress to pass something that can both have, I want a secure border, that can have border security, that can secure our border and also have just and compassionate immigration laws. So I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think the vast majority of Americans, if you really dialogued on this issue, would say, of course, we want a safe and secure border. That really matters to all of us. And we also want there to be legal pathways for people to be able to seek asylum, to be able to come in and work in agriculture or whatnot, that we want those pathways. And we also want a safe and secure border.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, everybody, we're going to fit in one more break. Stick with us. We'll be right back with Chelsea Sobolik. Welcome back to Faith and Culture. We're talking to Chelsea Sobolik about the all-important issue of immigration and how as Christians we need to be thinking about and addressing and meditating on this issue. And Chelsea, one of the last questions I want to ask is, in your work with World Relief, how have you seen God moving as you've continued to advocate on this issue?
Oh man, what a great question. You know, I see the Lord at work in the lives of people who are never going to get to do a podcast with you, whose names and faces we're never going to get to know or see on the news media, but who are quietly, faithfully serving. One of the heartbeats of World Relief and why I love it so much is that we partner with local churches throughout the US and around the world. And there are thousands of faithful Christians who are loving their neighbor, who are welcoming the Afghan family who is being resettled, who are calling their congressman, who are faithfully serving their neighbor. And you and I are never going to, get to know all of them or their stories, but the Lord is at work through his church. And that is just so moving to me, that the church can't be stopped, and the church does what government can't and shouldn't do, which is be everywhere and serve all people. So, I've really seen God at work through his church and through his people and through pastors and people who are in love with him and love his people and love others who might not yet know him.
Real quick, Chelsea, for people who might not be familiar with World Relief, or maybe they are and they want to find ways that they can support the ministry and the advocacy work that you do, where can they go for more information?
Yeah, so worldrelief.com/advocate, we have a page where, maybe you're concerned about refugee resettlement. You can click and it'll give you more information and ways to get involved. So there's a number of different ways we encourage and hopefully equip people to get involved.
Awesome. Well, Chelsea Sobolik, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody, stick with us. We'll be right back to wrap up this week's episode of Faith and Culture. That is all the time we have for this week's episode of Faith and Culture. Thank you so much for being here. If you haven't already, check out the Faith and Culture podcast. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes come out each week. And of course, go to cbnnews.com and never miss any news of the day. Thank you so much for being here, and God bless you.